The snow didn't hide her blood. It just made it look like someone else's. It streaked across the white and faint pink trails, dripping from her fingers, freezing before it could fall too far. The wind came down from the high ridges in long, unbroken sighs, rattling the dead pine branches above. Her dress, once the pale blue of faded sky, clung stiff to her thighs, torn open at the hem. The sack on her shoulder sagged with a single loaf of bread, hard as brick, and a broken-handled broom. Each step sank her into the shin-deep crust, but she didn't slow. The cold bit her cheeks until they were raw, her one good eye watering, the other swollen shut from the fist that had found it that morning. Somewhere behind her, the world she knew was still spilling its noise, drunken hollers, the crack of splintering wood. But out here, it was only the creak of ice beneath her boots and the faint jangle of chain at her wrist. Far ahead, rising out of the twilight's bruised sky, a thin ribbon of smoke curled upward. A house, maybe. A cabin. Somewhere there was a fire. Bitterroot's main street was a strip of frostbitten rot. Half the storefronts stood boarded, their signs half swallowed by peeling paint, and the rest were just yawning doors into stale air, whiskey, coal oil, unwashed men hunched at crooked tables. The snow here was churned into gray slush, crusted with sawdust to catch the spit. Past the far end, the wilderness came hard and sudden, swallowing the horizon in black ridges and ice-choked streams, their edges gnawed by wolf tracks. Nothing gentle lived here. The wind scoured every face until it looked carved, and silence seemed always on the verge of swallowing the place whole. She had been in Bitterroot long enough to stop hoping for the better parts of people. The saloon kept her because someone had to scrub the blood off the floor when fights broke out. She did not serve drinks, she did not dance, and she sure as hell was not paid. Her payment came in the form of a crust of bread, sometimes moldy, sometimes stolen back from the rats, and the kind of insults men spit when they've forgotten you have ears. The owner, round-bellied, sweat-shined, eyes like dark marbles in dough, made sure she knew she was worth less than the soap she used to scrub the floor. The townsfolk had names for her. The Foundling, the Mute Girl, Doc's Mistake, on account of her being patched up by the town's half-drunk doctor after someone found her half dead in a ditch last winter. She barely spoke now, and when she did, it came out in the low rasp of a voice and used to carrying words. She kept her gaze low, her hands working, her breath quiet, but she listened. She learned who to avoid when the whiskey ran deep. She learned how long she could stay invisible. The first time she saw him was on a Tuesday, when the sky hung low and thick, promising snow. He came in from the mountains, tall, shoulders bent like the weight of the coat he wore had been earned over years. His left boot struck the floor differently, a limp hidden beneath a careful stride. Fur-lined collar dark with melt, the smell of pine pitch and smoke trailing after him. On his cheek, beneath the shadow of a coarse beard, a scar curved down in 3 sharp lines, pale against the windburn. The regulars called him the Trapper from Dead Horse Ridge, though nobody seemed to know his real name. He brought in pelts, heavy with frost, laid them out in silence for trade, and left with whatever the store had in return, flour, coffee, sometimes a coil of rope. When she slid his change across the bar that day, her eyes stayed fixed on the counter, fingers quick to pull back. He didn't look at her, not exactly, but there was a pause, just enough to feel like the air between them thickened, and then he turned and left. 2 days later, she saw him again. Outside in the street, a fight had broken out between 2 miners, both too drunk to land more than clumsy swings. The crowd pressed in, eager for something to fill the empty hours. The trapper didn't shout, didn't push. He stepped between them with the stillness of a man used to making animals stop without a rope, his hand closing on a shoulder, his voice low and flat. The men stopped. One spat, the other swore, but they both backed off. She watched from the saloon's doorway, her arms full of wet rags. For a reason she could not name, she felt as if he'd seen her standing there, even without looking. Not the way others saw her, like noticing a broken fence post, but like remembering the shape of a trail you'd walked long ago. That night the cold came down harder, brittle and sharp, sweeping the streets, clear except for the occasional gust chasing stray paper. The saloon's door shut behind her with a thud and a click, the lock falling in place. She had not finished her work fast enough. The man who owned the place didn't like paying for oil lamps to burn after hours, and he liked her less. The snow came at her sideways as she rounded the corner into the alley, the wind clawing into the gap at her collar. The barrels there smelled of old beer and ash, but their curve gave her shelter from the gusts. She lowered herself against one, pulling her thin dress tight, arms wrapping her ribs. Her breath fogged the air before freezing in her lashes. She counted heartbeats until the numbers slipped away. Somewhere in that white silence, she heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on snow. Heavy boots. Coming closer. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and the soft rasp of a knife against leather. The first thing she noticed was weight. Thick wool blankets draped over her, their rough weave holding in a heat she hadn't felt in months. The second was the quiet, broken only by the groan of the fire and the slow, methodical sound of hands working. In the corner, by the lamplight's amber glow, he sat with a snowshoe across his knee, tightening rawhide with a patience that looked older than he was. The scar on his cheek caught the light now and then, a pale slash beneath the beard. He glanced over once, not long enough to search her face, then looked back at the snowshoe. When she tried to push herself upright, the blanket slipped and the cold air bit her arms. He set the snowshoe aside, rose, and crossed the room with a bowl. Steam curled from the stew inside, carrying the smell of venison, onion, and wild herbs. He placed it in her hands without a word. She ate slowly, unsure if it was safe to empty the bowl, fingers trembling so much she nearly spilled it. He didn't watch her, not directly, but the way he moved, quietly, deliberately, keeping his distance without turning away, told her he knew she was watching him. Like a deer watches the tree lean for movement, his days had a shape to them. She soon learned. Before the sun burned the frost off the windows, he was already dressed, boiling water for tea. The fire never went out. He kept it alive as if the cabin itself depended on its heart beating. He would haul logs in from the lean-to, set traps in the high timber, boil pelts until the cabin smelled of earth and iron. At night, when the light thinned, he carved small animals from scraps of pine. Elk, fox, once a bear with its mouth half open. The limp slowed him, but it was part of him now, the same way his scar was. He never told her about the war that had left him walking unevenly, nor the bear trap that had come down on him years later, and she never asked. The first time she moved to help, she did it without thinking, folding his shirt after patching a tear at the shoulder, stacking kindling by the hearth. He said nothing, but she noticed the shirt was gone the next day, worn without the hole showing. That night, when he handed her a tin cup of coffee, she whispered her first word in his presence. "Thanks." It came out small, like testing a fragile bridge. He nodded once. "You're welcome." The way he said it was not casual. It was as if he understood how much she had given up to say anything at all. She learned his name without asking. Jonas, carved into the stock of his rifle in deep, steady letters. He called her girl, not as a dismissal, but like a man holding something unnamed in his hands. The snow had been falling 3 weeks when the outside world found its way up the mountain. Word had carried through the valley that the trapper had taken in that useless girl from the saloon. The knock on the cabin door was sharp, hurried. Jonas opened it to the whiskey-bellied brute from Bitterroot. "She's mine," the man said, without looking at her. "Owes me for what she's eaten. Send her back." Jonas didn't lean on the doorframe, didn't step forward. He just stood there, broad and unmoving. "No." The man's face went red. "Ain't your business." Jonas shut the door before the sentence could finish. The latch clicked. He turned back to the table, poured himself more coffee, as if the man outside didn't exist. She sat frozen on the bench, bowl in her hands, unable to swallow. No one had ever stepped between her and harm before. Not like that. Not in a way that cost them something. The winter deepened until the snow lay high against the windows. The wind howled across the ridge, like an animal looking for a way in. They didn't speak much, but words became less necessary. Sometimes they shared coffee by the fire, the steam rising between them like a fragile bridge. Other times they walked the trapline together, the mountains muffled in white, his coat heavy on her shoulders when the wind cut too deep. He sharpened his knife each night with long, slow strokes, the steel whispering against the stone. She realized, watching him, that he was teaching her something. How to be steady, how to take your time and still get where you're going. Her bruises faded. She caught herself humming once while mending a glove, stopping when she realized he was listening. But he didn't say a word, just went on patching the strap of a snowshoe, as if the sound had always been there. One night, they sat across from each other at the table, a candle between them throwing shadows high against the log walls. He set down the carving knife he'd been using on a half-finished elk and looked at her. "World's wrong about you," he said quietly. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. He held her gaze. "Most precious thing I found." The snow had begun to rot, sagging in on itself, gray where the dirt bled through. Rivers ran loud now, swollen with meltwater that chewed at their own banks. The air smelled different, wet earth, pine sap, the faint rot of things that had been buried under ice too long. It should have felt like a release, but it didn't. Bitterroot's voices carried farther without the muffling snow, and what they carried was poison. She heard it when Jonas was in town trading, whispers that she was his kept woman, that he'd pulled stolen gold out of the mountains and buried it under the cabin floor. Every mouth that spoke seemed eager to make the story darker, meaner, until it felt like the whole valley wanted them both gone. That afternoon, she had gone down to the riverbank with a bucket, meaning to fill it before the ice broke completely. The current was quick, licking at the edges of the remaining shelves of ice. She didn't hear them at first, two shapes moving up from the willows, until they were there, too close. Both carried the smell of whiskey, though the day had hardly passed noon. She knew them from the saloon, men who had thrown dice until their pockets were empty, who measured a person's worth in how much they could take from them. "Town's missing you," one said, stepping between her and the path back. "She belongs there," the other added, his voice oily. "Not up here playing wife to some trapper." When she tried to slip past, a hand caught her arm. It didn't matter that she twisted, didn't matter that she said nothing. They dragged her anyway, boots skidding in the mud as they pulled her toward the road that led back to Bitterroot. By the time they reached the first buildings, her bucket was gone, lost somewhere along the river's edge. She could feel eyes on them, the same faces that had called her names now watching to see how far this would go. The saloon's door swung open before they reached it, and the owner stepped out, broad as the doorway, his grin wide enough to split his face. "Look what wandered back," he said, voice dripping mock sweetness. One of the men shoved her forward. She stumbled, caught herself on her hands in the dirt street. The door yawned behind the owner, spilling the stink of beer and old smoke. That's when she heard it, the steady, measured thud of boots that did not hurry, but did not stop. Jonas came up the street with a sack over one shoulder, the other hand resting light on the butt of his rifle. His eyes moved once over the scene. Her on the ground, the owner blocking the way, the two men grinning like they'd done something worth pride. He didn't shout, didn't bare his teeth. He simply stepped into the space between her and them, the air around him suddenly heavier. The sack dropped from his shoulder into the dirt. "She's not yours," he said. The owner's grin faltered. "She owes me." Jonas's hand shifted on the rifle. Not a threat. Not yet. Just a reminder that it was there, and that he had carried it through winters worse than this one. "No," he said again. Silence thickened until it pressed on every rib. One by one, the faces in the watching crowd lowered their eyes. The owner stepped back, muttering something meant for no one to hear. The two men who had dragged her loosened their grip on nothing and found somewhere else to be. Jonas turned then, offering her his hand. She hesitated only long enough to glance at the open street, then took it. His palm was rough, warm, grounding. He pulled her up like she weighed nothing, and together they walked back the way he had come, his sack left behind where it had fallen. They didn't speak until the cabin was in sight, the ridge behind it still holding patches of stubborn snow. He stopped at the door, let her pass in first, then closed it behind them with the same finality he had used that day months ago when the saloon owner had come knocking. For a long while they moved in the quiet rhythms they had made for themselves, water on the stove, fire stoked high. the smell of pine pitch curling into the air. She could still feel the heat of his hand in hers, the way it had pulled her out of the dirt. When the last light began to fade through the window, he spoke without looking at her. "Ain't the kind of man to go looking for trouble," he said, "but I'll stand in its way if it comes for you." Something in her chest ached, not like the hollow ache she had carried before, but like something stretching, finding space. She thought of the river's rush, the snow breaking apart, the sound of his boots in the street. She thought of the words he'd said once, by candlelight. "Most precious thing I've found. The world outside the cabin could keep its stories. This one would be theirs,